7-year-old Emma Brownlee clutched her pink piggy bank tightly against her chest, the faint jingling of coins barely audible over the hushed tension in the auction hall. Her small hands trembled, knuckles white from gripping the ceramic so hard, as she watched the bidding numbers climb higher and higher, each new figure pushing her fragile hope further away. Her wide, tear-rimmed eyes darted anxiously between the auctioneer and the German shepherd standing across the room. Rex, her late father's loyal canine partner, stood poised and alert, his dark eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on her. The moment their gazes met, his ears pricked forward, and he let out a low, desperate whine, straining against his leash in a silent plea. To Emma, Rex was not just a dog, he was the last connection to her father, Deputy Samuel Brownlee, who had died in the line of duty. The thought of losing Rex, too, was unbearable. Since her father's passing, Emma had barely spoken, her voice locked away in the depths of her grief. Yet, with Rex, the words still came in whispered secrets and quiet companionship. He had been there for her tea parties, tolerated her dressing him in silly costumes, and, most importantly, had listened when no one else could. Now, as adults around her bid tens of thousands of dollars, she sat there helplessly, the weight of her small savings pressing against her chest. It wasn't just an auction, it was a fight for the only piece of her father she had left. Across the crowded auction hall, Margaret Brownlee tightened her hold around Emma's small, trembling shoulders, feeling each shaky breath her daughter took. The weight of the moment pressed heavily upon them both. Emma clutched her pink ceramic piggy bank so tightly against her chest that her knuckles turned white, the soft jingling of coins barely audible beneath the rapid pounding of Margaret's own heart. She glanced down at her daughter's tear-streaked face, her wide, red-rimmed eyes fixed on the German shepherd standing across the room. Rex, her late husband's canine partner, had always been more than just a working dog. He had been a steadfast presence in their lives, a guardian, a silent protector, and, for Emma, the closest thing to family left of her father. Margaret saw it before anyone else did, the way Rex's ears pricked forward the moment he spotted Emma, his body tensing as if instinctively drawn to her. Then, with a sudden lunge, he pulled hard against his handler's grip, letting out a low, desperate whine. The leash strained, his powerful muscles rippling with effort, but the handler yanked him back before he could reach the little girl who was everything to him. A murmur swept through the crowd. They had seen it too. The undeniable, unbreakable bond between a grieving child and the dog who had never stopped looking for the family he lost. Margaret swallowed hard, blinking back tears. She knew how much Rex had meant to Samuel, how the two had trusted each other with their lives. She also knew how much he had meant to Emma. As a toddler, she had spent countless afternoons curled up beside the large shepherd, her tiny fingers tangling in his fur as she whispered secrets only he could hear. He had endured her tea parties with unwavering patience, letting her drape beaded necklaces around his thick neck, and he had stood protectively by her side through every scraped knee and bad dream. But more than that, he had been there when Samuel wasn't, when he had left for his shift that fateful morning and never come home. Now, with each rising bid, Margaret felt the crushing weight of helplessness. She could see the determination in Emma's tearful eyes, the way she anxiously counted the coins she had saved over the years, her little hands shaking as she arranged them in neat piles. Her whole body seemed to shrink under the realization that no matter how tightly she clung to her piggy bank, no matter how much she wished, it wouldn't be enough. Margaret's chest tightened at the sight, her own hands curling into fists. This wasn't just an auction. It wasn't about rules or policies. It was about a little girl desperately trying to hold on to the only piece of her father she had left. And as Margaret gazed at the German shepherd still straining toward Emma, his dark eyes locked on her as if pleading for a chance to stay, she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let them take Rex away. She had to find a way. No matter what it took. Margaret's heart pounded against her ribs as the auctioneer's voice echoed through the hall, each bid rising higher, pushing Rex further out of reach. She clenched her fists at her sides, trying to steady herself, but the weight of helplessness pressed down on her shoulders. Emma stood beside her, gripping her porcelain piggy bank so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The little girl's lips moved soundlessly, counting the coins inside as if sheer willpower could make them multiply. But Margaret already knew the truth, the harsh, unforgiving truth. No matter how many pennies and crumpled bills Emma had saved, it would never be enough. the numbers being thrown around the room weren't just numbers, they were walls, rising higher and higher, threatening to separate them from Rex forever. Across the room, the dog stood in a corner, ears flicking with every sound, his dark eyes darting between Margaret and Emma. He could sense it, the desperation, the fear. He let out a soft whine, shifting his weight from one paw to the other, his entire body tensed as if ready to bolt toward them. Margaret swallowed hard. He didn't belong in this cold, impersonal auction house, surrounded by people who saw him as nothing more than property. He belonged with them. With Emma. With the home where he had once curled up beside Samuel's worn-out boots, waiting for a master who would never return. Another bid rang out, sharp and final, cutting through the air like a knife. Margaret's breath hitched. The well-dressed man in the front row lifted his paddle again, his face blank, indifferent. To him, this was just another purchase, another transaction. He wasn't thinking about the little girl standing behind Margaret, fighting back tears with everything she had. He wasn't thinking about the way Rex had once rested his head on Emma's lap, offering silent comfort on nights when grief felt too heavy to bear. He wasn't thinking about the way Emma had whispered Samuel's name into Rex's fur, as if somehow, through that bond, she could still hold on to the father she had lost. Margaret turned to her daughter, her chest tightening at the sight. Emma's small shoulders trembled as she stared at the auctioneer, her blue eyes filled with unshed tears. But she didn't cry. She bit her lips so hard it turned pale, her tiny hands still clutching the piggy bank as if it were the only thing anchoring her to hope. Margaret recognized that pain, that silent kind of heartbreak, the same feeling that had crushed her the day she received the call about Samuel, the day she had to sit Emma down and explain that Daddy wasn't coming home. No. She couldn't let this happen again. She couldn't let Emma lose Rex too. Before doubt could creep in, before fear could paralyze her, Margaret drew in a shaky breath and straightened her spine. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand tall. The room blurred at the edges, voices blending into an indistinct hum, but she focused on one thing, the weight of Emma's hope pressing against her heart. With a steady hand, she raised her paddle. A murmur spread through the crowd, a ripple of surprise and curiosity. The auctioneer paused, eyes flicking to Margaret as if reassessing her. Across the room, the well-dressed man frowned, his fingers twitching slightly, but he hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his composed expression. Margaret tightened her jaw. She didn't have a fortune. She didn't have the certainty that she could outbid them all. But she had something stronger. A mother's love. And she wasn't leaving without Rex. The auctioneer's gaze swept across the crowded room, his sharp eyes locking onto Margaret as he registered her bid. For a fleeting moment, silence stretched over the hall, tense, expectant, thick with anticipation. The weight of it pressed down on Margaret's chest, making it difficult to breathe. She tightened her grip on Emma's small hand, feeling the rapid pulse beneath her fingers. She could sense her daughter trembling, not from fear but from hope, raw, desperate hope that had been absent for too long. Across the room, the well-dressed man hesitated. His polished shoes gleamed under the auction house lights as he shifted his weight, his fingers hovering near his paddle. He was considering, calculating. Margaret could see it in his furrowed brow, the slight purse of his lips. She wanted to scream, to plead with him not to raise his paddle again. Her heart thundered in her chest, every beat a prayer, every breath a plea. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply and shook his head, a subtle but decisive movement. Slowly, he lowered his paddle to his lap. Margaret's entire body sagged with relief, her knees nearly giving out beneath her. Emma gasped beside her, her grip tightening like a vice around Margaret's fingers. Across the room, the auctioneer's voice rang out, slicing through the air with finality. Going once. Margaret swallowed hard, her mouth dry. Going twice. The entire hall seemed to be holding its breath. Even Rex, restrained on a short leash near the auction platform, stood still, his intelligent eyes scanning the room, his ears twitching as if he, too, understood the moment's significance. Sold! The auctioneer's gavel struck the podium with a resounding crack. The sound echoed in Margaret's ears, sending a jolt through her spine. A choked sob burst from Emma's lips, half laughter, half disbelief. Before Margaret could react, her daughter threw herself into her arms, burying her face against her chest. Margaret wrapped her arms around Emma, pressing a trembling kiss to her hair. She could feel the girl's body shaking, her breath hitching with overwhelming emotion. Tears burned behind Margaret's eyes, but she refused to let them fall just yet. They had won. Rex was theirs. The moment the auction concluded, a handler stepped forward, leading Rex toward them. The dog strained against the leash, his claws scraping against the polished wooden floor in his eagerness to reach them. His tail wagged frantically, his whole body vibrating with excitement. When the leash was finally handed over, Emma dropped to her knees, barely able to contain her joy. "Rex," she cried, throwing her arms around the dog's thick neck. Rex let out a high-pitched whimper, a sound filled with longing and relief, as he buried his face against her shoulder. His tail wagged so hard that his entire hindquarters swayed. Margaret knelt beside them, reaching out to run her fingers through Rex's fur. It was coarser than she remembered, unkempt from weeks of uncertainty, but he was warm. Solid. Real. "You're coming home, boy," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Rex let out a small, contented huff, pressing his nose against her palm. Margaret glanced at Emma and saw something in her daughter's eyes she hadn't seen in a long time, a spark of happiness, pure and unguarded. It had been missing ever since Samuel's passing, replaced by sorrow and a hollow emptiness. But now, at this moment, that light was back. Margaret let out a shaky breath, a smile breaking across her lips. No matter how difficult things had been, no matter how uncertain the future remained, they had won this battle. And for now, that was enough. As Margaret and Emma stepped out of the auction house, the cool evening air wrapped around them, carrying the crisp scent of damp earth and the distant promise of rain. Margaret inhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling with a sense of relief so profound it almost felt unreal. The tension that had gripped her throughout the bidding, tightening like an invisible chain around her ribs, slowly began to loosen. The auction had been a battle, a nerve-wracking, heart-pounding ordeal, but they had won. They had Rex. Beside her, Emma clutched her hand tightly, her small fingers digging into Margaret's palm as if to reassure herself that this was real. In her other hand, she held onto Rex's leash with equal determination, afraid to loosen her grip even for a second. The golden retriever trotted beside them, his tail wagging in excited bursts, his eyes bright with recognition. He let out a happy little huff, nudging Emma's leg as if to say, "We did it. We're together again, The streets were quiet at this hour, bathed in the soft flickering glow of street lamps, their golden light stretching into long, shifting shadows along the cobblestone path. Each step Margaret took felt lighter than the last, as though she had been carrying a weight on her back for months and only now realized how much it had burdened her. The thought of losing Rex forever had haunted her, filling her nights with restless sleep and her days with an ache she could not soothe. He was more than just a dog. He was a living, breathing piece of Samuel, her late husband, the man she had loved so deeply, the father Emma had adored. Emma looked up at her mother, her wide, tear-brimmed eyes glistening in the lamplight. She bit her lip, struggling to contain the overwhelming emotions bubbling up inside her. "I can't believe he's really ours again," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. It trembled with the remnants of fear, of uncertainty, of all the silent prayers she had whispered to the universe, hoping that somehow, some way, they wouldn't lose Rex forever. Margaret stopped walking for a moment and turned to her daughter, gently squeezing her hand. "He was always ours," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "We just had to bring him home." At the sound of her voice, Rex looked up at her, his warm brown eyes filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. He had been through so much, dragged away from them, placed in an unfamiliar world, waiting, hoping, just as they had. Margaret reached down and ran her fingers through his thick fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest beneath her touch. He leaned into her, letting out a soft, contented sigh, as if he, too, had finally found peace. The night air wrapped around them like a comforting embrace as they continued walking, their pace unhurried. Margaret felt something stir deep within her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Life was still uncertain. Money was tight, the hole Samuel had left in their hearts would never truly heal, and the road ahead would not be easy. But tonight, as she walked hand in hand with Emma, Rex trotting loyally at their side, she felt, for the first time in a long while, that they were going to be okay. Tonight, they were whole again.